Hey everybody, Doomway here, and welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online challenges from the weekend, sometimes some paper tournaments when those are available, and we compile all the data and we take a look at what everybody played, and potentially maybe even some sweet decks to highlight at the end of the metagame section. We do have some sweet ones for you today, I promise that. But we are going to start, as we always do, with Modern. Now, for folks who maybe have been living under a rock, there was a pretty big shakeup to Modern yesterday, so we're not really going to spend too much time here. But this is sort of the last hurrah for Boros Energy, the send-off, if you will. And to the surprise of nobody, Boros Energy was still the most played deck. I can assure you, at least I hope, that the metagame looks quite a bit different when we have this segment next week, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of sweet decks to take a look at. But yeah, this is the end of Boros as we know it. No more Ring, no more Raptor, and yeah, this is pretty much it. Boros Energy was a menace for the better part of the last 5 months, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm not that sad to see it go. But with all of that, just a little shout out to Boros Energy. Let's take a look and see if we can transition over to Pioneer. It looks kind of interesting, where last week Rakdos Demons 16.7%, this week roughly a little bit higher, 23%, maybe a bit higher than I'd like, but Rakdos Demons is certainly the most played deck. It's extremely powerful, Unholy Annex. I did kind of notice the versions were split a little bit between some were playing Blade, some weren't playing. I'm not sure I love that card. It is a 2-mana 3/1 with not really that much text, and it kind of like makes you a little bit weaker to Fatal Push in some regards. So I don't know if I'm a huge fan of that card, but the people who are playing the Rakdos deck seem to be kind of split on that decision. Rakdos Prowess, roughly about the same. Is it Phoenix took a bit of a dip. Lotus Field, roughly about the same. Niv took a bit of a dip. The one thing that I really want to highlight about this is Azorius Humans. Last week, 1.6%. This week, 10%. That is a massive increase. And I think that is partly due to the fact that it won the Magic Online Championship Showcase. And a lot of times, what people who are playing challenges and things, they'll go onto Goldfish, they'll see what the most recent event was, take the winning list, copy paste it, and just fire it up. At least some people do. And I think that is partly why you see Azorius Humans with such a high play rate compared to what it was last week. But yeah, that is the Pioneer metagame. I mean, it looks pretty good. Maybe the demon share is a little bit too high, but for the most part, all of this, everything else looks pretty good. And I think that the format itself, in terms of diversity, looking pretty healthy. But as far as the challenges were concerned, we had 5 total challenges. They were won by Blue White Humans, Jund Sacrifice, Jund Creativity, Lotus Field, the Artist Talent version, and Rakdos Demons. Now, with that out of the way, I got a couple of interesting decks that I wanted to showcase to you guys today. First up here from Hernan72, I posted a video with the standard version of this deck. I think Ash has been doing some content on it. There's been a lot of people playing the Blue-White Glyph deck in standard, and this is sort of the Pioneer version, the Pioneer port of that. Now, you might ask yourself, what do you get in Pioneer that you don't have access to in standard? First and foremost, Smuggler's Copter. Pretty good card. Has been unbanned for what, about a year now? A little over a year, I think. And it's kind of funny. I think a lot of people really thought that Smuggler's Copter was going to sort of homogenize a lot of different things in the format because it's an artifact. Every single deck can play Copter. Now, not every deck wants to play Copter. And I really like the way that, I think this is like the perfect unban for Pioneer, where it really hasn't been completely over the top. It's not in every deck. It's giving the aggressive decks a tool to help fight against sweepers and things that they're usually weak to. So I think I'm a big fan of it. You also get another copy of Inspector, which brings us up to 12 now with 4 Thraben, 4 Novice, and 4 Spyglass. You get Portable Hole, which is a good artifact, 1 mana, kill a small thing, and all of this leads to playing Ensoul Artifact over Glyph. So you want more 1-mana artifacts that you can set up for a turn 2 Ensoul, because in Standard, you can wait until turn 2 to play your Inspector. You don't have to play it on turn 1 because you don't have an Ensoul in your deck. But Ensoul kind of makes this deck basically a full turn faster because you're making your 5-power creature a full turn earlier, so that's pretty huge. You get Metallic Rebuke and Spell Pierce, which for some reason is not legal in Standard, and Better Mana, Hallowed Fountain, Hengegate Pathway, cards that we don't have access to in Standard. So a pretty good number of upgrades here. And a big shout out to Hernan72 for top 8ing with this Azorius in Soul deck. Next up, we have an old favorite of mine, Gruul Vehicles. Now, you may ask yourself, what's new about this deck? There is one thing that I wanted to highlight, Screaming Nemesis, where this card has been a fixture of standard red decks, hasn't really made the full jump over into Pioneer yet, but I think Screaming Nemesis is very, very good when you get to play 8 elves. I tried doing this in standard, sort of like a red-green mid-range deck with Llanowar Elves and Screaming Nemesis. Didn't quite work out because the hands where you didn't have Elf, it just felt like your deck kind of didn't do much. But when you have access to 8 of them, you're going to have those draws more often. I love the 4 Crowan Wars main deck, especially with the presence of Demons becoming the most played deck in Pioneer. This card is phenomenal against them, especially when you can combine it with a vehicle, because you can use the vehicle to tap the creature before the 3rd chapter of Crowan War to guarantee that their demon dies. Main deck Pick Your Poison is certainly a statement against those demon decks as well. Next up, we have Xbox Greg. Shout out to my boy Ben. At 28th place with Elves. Now, a couple of new cards here that Elves has received over the past few months, notably Elvish Archdruid, which is a card that I tried in Standard. I actually haven't had the opportunity to play it Elves yet in Pioneer with Archdruid, but it seems like it makes a lot of sense. Deck wants to make a bunch of Elves, Elvish Archdruid makes a bunch of mana when you have a bunch of Elves. The other card that I really like here, which I didn't love before, but I think gets a lot better with the introduction of something like Archdruid, is Tyvar, because Tyvar gives your Archdruid haste, kind of, and if you have a battlefield of 6 or 7 elves, you can now use Archdruid as a ritual to then, maybe you're spending that mana on something like Leafcrown Visionary activations, or potentially even Tyvar the Pummeler, which is another new card here from Duskmourn. I like it because it's got some protection, it gives you another mana sink, which you had before, but you only had War Master, so some pretty good upgrades here for Elves, and interesting list. And last but not least, we have Alberto Esti in 11th place with Blue-Black Oculus. But wait, this isn't Modern. So this is an interesting take. The way that I look at this deck, it feels like Phoenix without the Phoenixes. And we have pieces of the puzzle and Ledger Shredder to mill over to help us get enough cards to hardcast Oculus. We only have 2 copies of No One Left Behind. Now, personally, I think I'd want to see more of them because, yes, you can reanimate a Boron Oculus, but even just reanimating something like a Ledger Shredder and following that up with a cantrip sounds pretty appealing to me. And you can also get back a Shielder for 5 mana. The usual fare, cantrips, kill spells, nothing too crazy going on here. But yeah, just wanted to highlight this as like a sort of a different take on Phoenix. Still using the graveyard a lot, but yeah, this one looks pretty interesting, and that is going to do it for Pioneer, which means we only have Standard left to take a look at. And Standard we will take a look at. This is the metagame of the challenges over the past weekend. Dimir midrange, still the king, although taking a bit of a dip from 26 to 21. Golgari, roughly about the same. Jeskai Convoke, roughly about the same. Gruul Prowess, pretty big resurgence in that. I think a lot of that was just the Mono Red players switched to Gruul, you see, because Mono Red went from 7 to 2, and Gruul went from 7 to 13. So I think they just said, okay, well, let's start adding green cards to our deck, because green card's good. 5-color Overlords, roughly the same. Mono White Tokens and Simic Terror, both taking some pretty big hits. The other one here, Boros Prowess, which was effectively nowhere to be seen last week, and this week is everywhere. So it seems like the people who were playing Mono Red before have decided to try to splash a color and see how that fares, and for the most part, I think they did pretty well. Other than that, Temur Prowess, Selesnya Cage got a bit of a bump here, rounding it out. But yeah, pretty stable metagame it looks like. There's definitely some things that are fluctuating week to week, and that is that. 5 decks here, really quick, to show you. First up here from Tulio Jotti in 15th place. Tulio has been putting a lot of work into these various Boros midrange decks, and this most recent addition to the deck list is Bruce Tarl, Roving Rancher, which allows you to exile the top card of your library. If it's a land, you make an Ox. Otherwise, you can play it till the end of your next turn. So it kind of gives you a way to get some card advantage. And there's been versions of this deck that are kind of more Discover focused with Atali's Favor, Appraiser. They only hit into Recruiter, and there's some weird things going on. But I think I like this approach better. You're kind of just higher card quality with Peacekeeper, just a fine card, Screaming Nemesis, removal spells, Burst Light and Get Lost Landing Helix, Quintorius is a card advantage engine, and the aforementioned Bruce Tarls to kind of give you a little bit of card advantage. Not sure if I would play the full 4 because it is a legendary card, it is a 4-drop, but nonetheless, an interesting take on kind of these red-based mid-range decks, and pretty cool one here from Tulio. Now, I myself am not a up-the-beanstalk enjoyer per se, but I did want to shout out Cantor Gianni in a 15th place for this particular list. This is Domain, but not Domain. This is really just Abzan. The only sort of non-Abzan card we have is Lane Binding, which, you know, you can actually me it's a white card, but you do need you need to basically have Hot Woods in order to cast this for 1 mana. But yeah, this feels to me as sort of very similar to, I don't know if you guys remember the Seth Manfield, Jim Davis, Golgari Beans deck from the World Championships. It feels like more closer to that than Domain or Golgari. It's like a hybrid between those two. Splashing white for Seize from Slumber, Scroll Shift, Leyline Binding. Still has the Virtue Persistences, Lotto Removal here, Paw Patch, the 1 Outrageous Robbery. I kind of would like to see both a full 4 copies of each Overlord here, because Mistmoors is extremely powerful, and then make sure your Beanstalk's a lot better. But, I mean, look at how many ways we have to trigger Beans, even in the removal spell department. So, yeah, white also gives you Sunfall. I feel like this is maybe more green-white splashing black, but then you're splashing 4 double black cards. Anyways, it's an Abzan deck. You see the point, but just a different take on the Beans archetype. Speaking of different takes on archetype, from Atarka711, this is blue-white, but there's no Zoetic Glyphs. Where'd the artifacts go? This is sort of blue-white Convoke, where we're playing Knight Errant of Eos, so we're kind of leaning into the Jeskai Convoke shell with that, with like Mockingbird, Novice Inspector, Spyglass Siren, and Warden of the Inner Sky. But instead of playing red cards and being lower to the ground, we've increased the curve slightly for Aven Interrupter, Werefox Bodyguard, Fairy Mastermind, and Flood Pit Drowner. So a bit of an interesting take. It's basically, they took a lot of the artifact synergies, like the Steel Seraphs and the Zoetic Glyphs, and they replaced them with stuff like Knight Errant of Eos and Flood Pit Drowner. Is that better? That's for you to decide. I'm not sure if it's better. It is something that I do want to try out, though, because I've been working a lot on this blue-white deck for the upcoming GP, but not really a GP, in Atlanta. That's coming up in, 2-3 weeks at this point? So I'm probably going to play some version of blue-white, and this one might be on my radar. I'm going to have to give it a shot. Speaking of different versions of blue-white, Edel, yes, that is Willie Edel, Hall of Famer, in 6th place here, where we've kept a lot of the artifact stuff. Steel Seraph still here, but we've removed the glyphs just for Enduring Curiosity, and we're still playing Flood Pit Drowner. So this is similar to the previous list. There's just no Werefox Bodyguards and no Knight Errant of Eoses, and those have been replaced with Curiosities and Steel Seraphs. So again, there's a lot of different ways to build this blue-white deck, and a lot of things that are still left to try. I don't know if I like cutting the glyphs, because at least the way that I see it is that glyph is one of your better cards against the mid-range decks, since the Dimir deck doesn't really have a way to stop you before the glyph comes into play. Like, they don't have Terra Sunder or bounce spells or anything like that, and they're always going to be down a card when they have to trade for the glyph token. So I don't know, but yeah, it's interesting to see that there's multiple different blue-white decks without it. Now, I mentioned Discover earlier. This is certainly a take on the Discover archetype. So, Autonomous Assembler, basically the idea here is Geological Appraiser and Etali's Favor gets to discover, right? Now, when these discover, what are we discovering into? You'll notice that every single card in this deck has more than 3 mana value, except the best white card in Standard, Sheltered by Ghosts. It is interesting to see, like, usually when you see Cascade, Violent Outburst, Shardless Agent, you know that there's going to be some 4/4s coming. You must be asking yourself, like, man, they're really good at hitting Sheltered by Ghosts. And it's weird to see just the idea of cascading into a removal spell, but that's how good Sheltered by Ghosts is. Now, a lot of the time these decks are just red-white, but this one is splashing blue for Roaring Furnace and This Town Ain't Big Enough, which looks kind of weird, but This Town, pretty good with Roaring Furnace / Steaming Sauna, And also, you can towning big enough to bounce your Itali's favor. There's a lot of cool stuff. You can bounce Appraiser to get another trigger. You can play Assembler early, and then this town to then cast it on turn 5 a little bit later. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with this town. So the mana, a little sketchy, of course. You know, you're playing a lot of tap lands, or I guess the temples are the only tap lands, but basically, not sure if the juice is worth the squeeze. I didn't even notice the sideboard. There's a Wildfire Howl, a Sword of Once and Future, a Wealth and Power. This is definitely a sideboard. But a cool take on these sort of Boros mid-range decks. And folks, that is going to do it for today's video. Thank you for watching another edition of Watching the Meta. Again, a little bit of a shorter one today, although we're still at almost 20 minutes. I don't know. How do I talk this much? Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Like, subscribe if you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next week for the big first Modern event. And until next time, adios.